Hey, everybody. All right, we're going to dive into our text for tonight. Well, not really a text. We're going to talk about the entire book of Deuteronomy in one fell swoop. Okay, so we have been going through the Old Testament in a series called The First Gospel. The idea being that the Old Testament is good news, just like the New Testament is, and that God is good. He's up to good stuff in the world. He's up to good stuff in our lives from the very beginning, not just when Jesus showed up, but the whole way. And that actually all of this is pointing to Jesus, who will one day be, as he describes himself, the fulfillment of all of it. So he doesn't come in and say that he's, singing off a new song sheet. He doesn't come in and say he's telling a new story. He says, I'm completing what was started there. So if he is the completion and we say that he is the gospel and the good news, then there must be goodness here as well. So we've been taking our time going through the Old Testament so far. We took a long time, a couple months in Genesis, a couple months in Exodus, then we hit Leviticus, and as we all do, we sped up because there's some heavy stuff in there. We talked Leviticus, a little bit of Numbers last week, and now this will be our last week in the Torah. So first 5 books of the Old Testament, Torah or Pentateuch, depending on which language you want to talk about. Deuteronomy tonight. So I want to give you a little overview for what the book is first, and then we'll talk about some of the main themes. Okay, so the book Deuteronomy, like I said, last book in the Old Testament or in the Torah. The name itself, Deuteronomy, it's two words. Deutero means second, and nomos means law. So it's the second law. Remember in Exodus, when God led the people out of slavery in Egypt, he took them to Mount Sinai where he gave them the law. We see that law gets expanded kind of throughout the book of Exodus, and Leviticus and Numbers discusses it as well. And then in Deuteronomy, the whole thing gets restated again. Now, why are we restating it again? You're going to find some new content, but a lot of repetition in the book of Deuteronomy. Why is it being repeated again? And the answer is because Deuteronomy takes place in a really unique geographical setting. It takes place on the edge of the Jordan River, looking into the Promised Land. Okay, so for 40 years, they've wandered the wilderness. All sorts of crazy stuff has happened. We've talked about how God fed them with manna in the wilderness. They drank water from a rock. They bowed down to a golden calf. They had all these crazy arguments with God and with Moses. There's a bunch of stories that we didn't even tell. So all this wild stuff happens in the wilderness for 40 years. And Moses himself actually gets wrapped up into the wildness because the second time God told him to give them water from a rock, the first time he said, smack the rock with your stick. And Moses did, and the water came out. The second time God said to speak to the rock, but Moses was so angry at the people that he decided to smack it with his stick again. And a bunch of other stuff ensues. And ultimately, at the end of all this, God says to all of his people that he led out of slavery in Egypt, none of you from this generation that walked out of Egypt will ever see the Promised Land, including Moses. Instead, your children will inherit the Promised Land. So all these people wander the wilderness for 40 years, knowing that they will never make it into the Promised Land, but their children will walk in. So when they get to the edge of the Jordan River, they're looking across into this place, and Moses, now an old man who's been leading them for years, is looking into a Promised Land that he will never set foot in, and is passing on the wisdom that he has gained over his years of leadership and his years of walking with God to this next generation so that when they enter the Promised Land, they can do it faithfully. They can be the kind of people that God called them to be. So this is kind of Moses' last will and testament. This is him standing in front of his people and with a father's ache in his heart or a grandfather's ache in his heart, saying, this is everything you need to know. He gives them just this passionate series of 3 speeches. Deuteronomy is made up of 3 speeches for Moses that are his farewell speeches. Everything I want you to know. One, if you want to think of it in these terms, because Moses at the end of the book he dies. I don't want to ruin it for you, but he dies at the end of the book. So this is his dying speech. It's his last words. And basically tonight I want to break down what he says to us. He says 4 things to the people of God in that moment as they enter the Promised Land, but throughout all generations, he speaks to us through the generations and says, here's the 4 most important things that Moses, prophet Moses, who saw God face to face, who talked to him in a burning bush, who was part of the plagues of Egypt, who saw all this crazy stuff and led God's people through all this crazy stuff and had the most remarkable experiences with God, ate a meal in God's presence on Mount Sinai, was sheltered by God's hand in the rock, all of this stuff. Moses, that Moses, one of the most important prophets in the Hebrew Bible, has 4 things to say to God's people through the generations. This is what he wants us to know about what it means to follow God, okay? 4 commands, actually, not just advice, but commands from a leader. And they are these: remember, love, fear, hold fast. Okay? Remember, love, fear, and hold fast. You can break down the book of Deuteronomy into these 4 themes, okay? Remember we talked about last week. I actually read this passage to you last week. I'm going to read it again. This is out of Deuteronomy chapter 8. It says, "When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you don't forget the Lord, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I'm giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and your flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land with venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble you and test you so that it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hand have produced this wealth for me. But remember, the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth and so confirms his covenant which he swore with his ancestors, as it is today. Remember. Basically, he's saying, okay, people of Israel, you're going to enter into the promised land. And when you do, you're going to leave behind, as Moses calls it, this vast and dreadful wilderness, and enter into a land that the Bible says is flowing with milk and honey. In other words, enter into a new reality. And in that new reality, your experience of God will be different. What do I mean by that? Well, remember the experience of God in the wilderness. What's it been? They have seen God as a pillar of fire. Why? Because they lived in tents. They were nomadic people. They moved from place to place. They followed the pillar of fire wherever it went. They moved. They were in a camp that was on the move all the time. And they were led by God. Well, what's going to happen in the promised land? He says you're going to settle down in homes. You're going to build cities. You're going to accumulate wealth for yourself. In that space, there will be no pillar of fire. Because you're not going to move from place to place. You're going to settle down in the land that I've given you. In the wilderness, you've eaten manna from the hand of God. Bread has rained down from the heavens. You've drunk water from a rock. That won't happen in the promised land. Why? Because the promised land is flowing with milk and honey. You'll enjoy the goodness that I have already set up, that I've prepared for you in that place. In the wilderness, you cry out to me, you argue with me, you yell at me because you're desperate to survive. In the promised land, you won't have that same edge to your life. You won't be in survival mode all the time. You'll be living normal life. And when you do, those visible, tangible kind of expressions of God that you have seen, that have guided you so powerfully, will not be the same in the promised land as they were in the wilderness. You're going to have to remember what it was like, because you're not going to see it the same way. That make sense? You're entering into a new phase of your relationship with God, and you won't see him at work in the same way there that you did back here. Now, that doesn't mean he isn't at work. He always is. As a matter of fact, he says, I'm the one that gave you the promised land. I'm the one that provided it for you. I'm the one that gives you the ability to produce everything you're going to produce there. He is working even there. You're just not going to see it in the same way. So in that space, you're going to have to learn to see differently. You're going to have to cultivate a new kind of vision to see that God is always at work, even when you can't see it. Sometimes we can't see it because of our stuff. It's our faults. In the promised land, in your normal life, you're going to be distracted. You're going to be racing from place to place as you're going about all the tasks of a day, the tasks and duties of normal life, and you're going to forget God in a way that you wouldn't have in the wilderness, because in the wilderness, normal life was different. It was simpler. I referenced COVID last week or 2 weeks ago. You remember how everything slowed way down in that wilderness season for a time? That's what the wilderness is often like. It's isolating and painful and difficult. Well, for most of us, maybe not for Heather, but for most of us, if you weren't leading a school through COVID. But for a lot of people, a lot just kind of ground to a halt. People noticed stuff that they hadn't noticed in a while, and people were crying out to God in ways that they hadn't cried out in a while, because that's what wilderness seasons tend to do. But then you get back to life and everything, it's almost like you're kind of in slow motion, and then everything just speeds back up to normal pace again. And then maybe even beyond normal pace, twice as fast. And pretty soon, where you used to see that pillar of fire just hovering right above the tabernacle, just right there, now you can go whole days without thinking of God at all. You know? Whole days without even being aware of his presence in your life. We get so distracted. We get so hurried. Sometimes we get so caught up in patterns of behavior that are actually out of alignment with the way that God works. We could call it sin or rebellion or whatever else, but we find ourselves in places where we're living out of alignment with him so long that our spiritual sensitivity, our eyes start to deaden. They start to numb a little bit. So there may be reasons that we're not seeing him at work that have to do with us. But there may be also reasons that have to do with him. It may be his fault that we're not seeing him at work in the same way. You know, sometimes he just stops speaking to us like he used to. Have you ever experienced that before? Where you had a season where it's like he's talking to me in this way, and then all of a sudden it just stops. Sometimes he seems cold or distant. Sometimes he prioritizes things that don't seem important to us at all, while ignoring the stuff that seems to really matter supremely to us. Sometimes he, just doesn't speak our love language, doesn't speak to us in the ways that we think that he ought to. Sometimes we're looking for a pillar of fire when he's just whispering, still quiet voice. So regardless of the reason, I think we can all agree that sometimes it just doesn't sound like or feel like God is listening, whether it's my fault or his fault or nobody's fault at all. Sometimes God changes the way he speaks to us because we're growing up. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. I've met with so many young people throughout my ministry who were like, hey, when I was in my teens, or in my early 20s, God spoke to me so clearly. Every time I went into worship, I felt his presence. It was amazing. And now I'm in this numb season and I can't figure out what I did wrong. What if you didn't do anything wrong? What if you're just growing up? And as hard as that is, parents know that, right? You talk very differently to a 5-year-old than you talk to a 15-year-old. Talk to a 25-year-old. Because their needs are different. As I was looking through this sermon today, I was thinking about our daughter, Marta, who lives in Georgia. And when she was 2, we were very present in her life at almost every turn. And she's going to listen to this message later, so I'll try to embarrass her a little bit. But it's like, eat this, don't eat that, touch this, don't touch that. Try, we have this famous story of a banana in our family where she would not eat a banana. And it was like the one, parents, sometimes you pick a battle where you're like, I have to win this one. Well, Heather and I picked this one, and it took 45 minutes to get her to take a bite of banana, but we won. But it was very present, hands-on. And now she lives in Georgia, and we get to talk to her. We text with her here and there, and we talk to her like really intentionally once a week. And that's hard. We miss her. She'll be home next week, which is awesome. But she's doing fine. She's doing great. She doesn't need us telling her, don't touch this, don't do that, because she's matured. Don't we think that the same is true of us and God, hopefully? If we walk alongside him for long enough, we ought to move from baby talk and the need for, as the Bible calls it, spiritual milk, into meat, to maturity, into growth, where we're no longer being carried, although he still has to carry us through seasons, but we're walking with him. We're talking to him. He's assigning us tasks as partners, as friends. So maybe God's silence isn't something you've done wrong at all. Maybe it's a sign of growth, maturity. Whatever the reason, that was a little bit of a tangent, but whatever the reason, sometimes he just talks to us differently than he used to. Sometimes it gets very quiet. Those moments, Moses says, remember. Remember, just because God isn't speaking the way he used to, doesn't mean he's not there. It doesn't mean something has changed. And I've just run into so many people in this kind of day and age where it's just easy to walk away from church and walk away from Jesus, who are like, I haven't heard him talk to me, he must not be real, kind of stuff, or like, well, that must have been a phase of my life, or whatever it is. I know I'm oversimplifying, but they just walk away as if everything they've experienced in the past never happened, because it's not happening in the present in the same way. But he still is who he says he is. He still is who he was to you before. The Bible says Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is still that he was. So remember who he has been in your life. Those seasons of quiet, those seasons of distance. Remember what you've seen of him before. That's why we have this. Remember the stories of what we've seen of him. Repeat those to yourself. Remember the ways that he has been at work in our lives and the lives of other people, the stories you've heard. And on the basis of that, remember who you are. I mean, the people of God will tell the Exodus story over and over and over again throughout the whole Bible and through the millennia since. For 3,500 years, they've been telling that same story. They can remember who God is and what he's done for them and their families. We never forget this stuff. We keep coming back to this because it defines us as a people. Remember who God is. Remember what he's done. Remember who you are. Memory, one of the greatest tools at our disposal as the people of God for maintaining our identity in a world opposite of who he is. If you're expecting to find your identity out there, you won't. Most of what happens outside of these doors will try to rip your identity in Christ away from you. The way we stabilize that in a world where it seems like we can't always see him at work, and we can't always hear his voice, and we can't always feel his touch, the way we stabilize that is by remembering. It's by drawing the power of the past into the present. And it encourages us, empowers us to move forward in our identities. You know, it's David. You think of Psalm 63. It's one of my favorite psalms. It's the psalm that David wrote when he was in the wilderness. We don't know why he was there. It was either because of his fault or somebody else's fault. It was either the time that Saul chased him out in the wilderness or the time that Absalom chased him out in the wilderness. The Saul one wasn't his fault. The Absalom one was. So either through his fault or somebody else's, he winds up in the wilderness. And what does he do when he's there? He writes about the tabernacle back in Jerusalem. He says, I've seen you in your sanctuary. Your power and your glory, they overwhelmed me. Drawing on the power of the memory of the presence of God from the past to a place where he does not experience the presence of God in the present. That sustains him. It's food for him. It nourishes him. I think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You guys know one of my favorite stories in the Bible. As they're staring into the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar is saying, just bow down to me and this could all go away. What do they say? Our God is able to deliver us from your hand. Our God is able to. Where are they getting that idea from? He's done it before. He has saved his people before. We know he can. Now, did anything about their present circumstance say that God was going to save them? No. There was nothing in that moment where they could see God at work. All they saw was fire and an angry king and people who just wanted to see their destruction. But they were living on the power of the past, what they had seen God do before, and more than that, who they knew God to be. Our God is able to deliver us from your hand, but even if he doesn't, we still won't bow. Because we know who he is, and he's still worth it. Still worth it. Don't see him in the present. Have seen. Think about Jesus in the wilderness, right? Dying of starvation, 40 days without food. And we tend to think that these tests that Satan came up with were kind of silly, but no, he's on the edge. Like 40 days is the extent of what a human being can survive without food. He's at the very edge. And the Satan comes to him and tempts him and says, just turn these stones into bread. And what does he remember? You remember what Jesus quotes? Deuteronomy. This, he says, doesn't live by bread alone, by every word that comes from the mouth of God. He's remembering the manna in the wilderness. In his own wilderness, Jesus draws from this very story. Sustain him and remind him who God is and who he is and why he's there. Memory is so significant. It provides us with perspective, hope. Why Christians wear crosses around their necks. To remember who Jesus is and what he's done. The reality is the cross isn't, we just sang about it. Different songs. Sing about it almost every week. 2,000 years later. Why? Because this is not just a lot of times Christians tend to think of the cross as like a gateway into life, as if we kind of enter in through the cross and then move on. But the reality is we camp ourselves out at the foot of the cross and live on the basis of that mercy and that one act, that love, that outpouring of love for the rest of our lives. It becomes our defining reality. It becomes the solid rock that we stand on to live. It becomes the lens through which we view the world. It becomes the way that we're supposed to shape the rest of our lives. That's why we wear a cross around our necks. Remember who he is. Remember what he's done and to remember who we are in light of it. Memory is so important. Moses says you have to remember. You have to draw the power of the past into the present if you're gonna live a faithful life as God's people. And it's not just for you to do as individuals, for all of us to do together. Remember some of the things that he's going to command, some of the ways that they're supposed to remember are feasts. Get together and have parties of remembrance. Get together and sing songs of remembrance. Find ways through first fruits and through tithing and through sacrifice to reenact the story over and over and over again. Pray prayers of remembrance. Read stories of remembrance out loud to each other. This is not something that's just supposed to happen in our heads. Memory is what we do as God's people. It's why we gather in this place. What are we doing right now? Right now, we're remembering Moses, reminding God's people to remember. Why we gather? Because, again, it's not going to happen out there. Remember who you are. Remember how he's at work in your life. Okay, so first one is remember. Second one, love. He says most famously in Deuteronomy 6:4. Most famous passages in the Bible, it's called the Shema because it starts out with the word Shema in Hebrew, which means hear or listen. Hear, O Israel. Shema Yisrael. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God. Heart, soul. Now, this passage in Deuteronomy 6 comes after Deuteronomy 5, which Deuteronomy 5 is Moses recapping the Ten Commandments. So he recaps the Ten Commandments, and then in Deuteronomy 6, he summarizes it in one statement. God is, love him. That's it. And later on, when Jesus is asked what's the most important commandment of all, he doesn't point to one of the 10, he points to this one as the one that sums them all up. The one upon which all of them stand. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Now, does it sound strange to anyone that love God is a command? We don't tend to think of love as a command, do we? We tend to think of it as a choice. So, is it interesting to anyone else that he commands us to love him first? Struck me as a little strange this week when I was prepping this, and so I kind of dug into it and started to think what is challenging to me about the idea that love is a command? I think the first thing that I wrestled with here is does it mean that we have no choice in the matter? And we clearly do. I mean, throughout the Bible, from Genesis 1 onward, he gives a choice. I mean, we talked about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as a choice. God allows us to not love him, to not choose him if we want. So I want to make it clear that when he commands us to love him, it doesn't mean he compels us to love him. It doesn't mean he forces us to. We still have a choice. C.S. Lewis talks about how we, of all beings in the universe, have the ability to disobey God's law. A rock dropped from my hand has no ability to disobey God's law. It will fall. But a human being has the ability to disobey its creator's purpose. But he commands us to love him, but he doesn't compel us to love him. That said, why does he command love? The answer is simple. Again, if you think through it through the lens of a parent. He knows what's best. And he knows that he is what's best for us. And if you know what's best for your kid, tell them in no uncertain terms, choose the thing that's best for them. That doesn't mean they will, but how many times, especially parents in the room or kids, have you received a command where your parent has said, do this thing or don't do this thing because they know what's best? And in this case, God knows that who he is and the life that he has created us to live is what's best for us. And therefore, he doesn't give us the option of other things. He doesn't say, what we tend to think of love is you go out there and you choose what you love, you find what you love. He's saying, no. Essentially, I promise you that anything else you choose is going to let you down. So if you want what's best, love me. Love me. Notice he doesn't start with obey me. We're going to get there in just a second. He starts with love me. Okay? So before we get to the commands, before we dig into the thou shalt and thou shalt nots, he starts with the command to love him. Because love will empower something that nothing else will empower. It will empower a level of obedience, a kind of obedience that nothing else can achieve. So often in our world today, we think of obedience in terms of punishment and consequence. And we even will read the Bible that way, as if God is a God who's out to punish and give his people consequences. But punishment and consequence and shame and condemnation are powerful motivators for a moment, but they can't sustain over the long haul. So instead, God says, come to me, love me, and as you love me, then that love will motivate your obedience. You will discover in him that he is what's best for you and that he wants what's best for you. And that what's best is the way of life that he's calling you to obey. And so that will then empower obedience in a way that nothing else would. Well, of course I'll obey. I know you just want what's best for me. Why would I do anything else? I've experienced you. And his command to love us follows his love for us. Notice that? What has happened in the story to this point is he has expressed his love for the Israelites in countless ways. Every single day for 40 years, providing food and water, rescuing them, forgiving them, putting up with them. I mean, day in and day out, he has led his people well. He has loved them well. And here on the edge of the wilderness, he's prepared a promised land for them. He says, now, as my people dearly loved, love me. In other words, it's like John says later on in 1 John. He says, we love him because first loved us. So the command to love is not from somebody who's angry with us. It's not from somebody who's needy or, codependent. It's none of these things. It's from somebody who has already lavished his love on us, who wants what's best for us, who knows he can provide what's best for us, who has a track record of providing what's best for us. Says, now, based on that history, love me with everything, because that love will enable you to sustain what I'm going to ask of you next. Okay? Because there is a next ask. There is a next command. We have remember, we have love. The next one is going to be fear or obey. And that's really important. I think we've lost some of that in the modern church because we get hung up on the love part, which is great. Really great. But we get hung up on being loved by God. And we get into these conversations of how we are so loved that even if I don't obey, it's going to be okay. What I mean by this is this sort of grace conversation. We get wrapped up in this grace versus works conversation, where we think that they're kind of opposed to each other. That like I'm so loved that I know that there's stuff that I should do, but if I can't quite seem to do it, it's no big deal because I'm so loved. And so we kind of oppose God's love for us and his expectations of obedience, when in fact, they're one and the same thing. He calls us to obey because he loves us. Because the stuff he's calling us to is best for us and for the world around us. And if we could just do it, I think about where we were in the summer when we were talking through the Sermon on the Mount. If we could just live that way, which Jesus seems to believe that we can, man, the world would be different. Because the way of life he calls us to is the best one. But it has to start with love. It has to start with being loved. You are not earning your way into love by obeying. You are living out of a place of belovedness, already loved. And understanding that love him too. Your obedience becomes an expression of that love. Not a way to avoid punishment, not some sort of guilt or shame, but an expression of your love. And that's what comes next. Remember, love God first, because love will empower what nothing else will. Then fear him. Listen to this. This is just a couple verses later. Deuteronomy 6:13. Fear the Lord your God and serve him only. And take your oaths in his name. Don't follow other gods, the gods of the people around you, for the Lord your God who is among you is a jealous God. So many of us read that just a couple verses after love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and they seem at odds with each other. What do you mean love and fear? Those two things don't seem to go together. And we have a really hard time reconciling that in the Bible because the Bible often uses language of fearing God, doesn't it? The fear of the Lord, Proverbs says, is the beginning of wisdom. The problem is we don't understand that the Bible has different words for fear, whereas in English we just have one. There are two different words for fear in Hebrew. One of them means terror. It's this like dread. The other means fear, like respect, honor. And I've had people often point, kind of the discrepancies here in Deuteronomy 6. They'll say, well, doesn't 1 John say that there is no fear in love because perfect love casts out fear? That's true. But John is talking about the second kind of fear. He's not talking about the first kind of fear, the terror, the fear of condemnation or punishment. John is saying over there, he's saying there is no fear of condemnation or punishment in perfect love. That doesn't mean there's no honor. That doesn't mean there's not a healthy kind of fear, though. There are two different kinds of fear. The first one, this kind of fear of this terror, this fear of condemnation or punishment. It's when John says it's opposed to love, what he means is this: that kind of fear is self-absorbed. It's about self-protection. Think about it for a second. If my motivating factor is a fear of punishment, then who am I thinking about the most? Myself. I don't want to experience punishment. I don't want to experience condemnation. I don't want to experience destruction. So I'm living out of this terror, this fear of condemnation, and that is the opposite of love. Because love, by definition, is other-focused. So John is saying over there, he's making a fairly sophisticated but also a fairly simple argument. He's saying this sort of terror that is self-protective and self-absorbed is the opposite of love because love is other-focused and other-absorbed. So those two things are mutually exclusive. And if you have received one, if you have received the other-focused love of God, then you have no need to fear and live out of a motivation that's self-absorbed. Okay? Does that make sense? That said, God, I don't want to use the word demands, but deserves perhaps both kinds of fear, doesn't he? He does deserve dread and terror, and throughout the Bible, he often inspires dread and terror. Because we find ourselves standing in the presence of a holy God and realizing that we don't deserve to be there. I think of Isaiah in Isaiah 6. It's one of my favorite passages, where Isaiah has this vision of God, and it says, I saw God seated on the throne, exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. And there was smoke, and there was fire, and there were these seraphim, which the word seraphim, they're these angelic creatures. Seraphim means burning ones. So these beings that are alight in the presence of God, that are covering their faces with their wings in his presence. I mean, this is how majestic, how glorious, how awesome he is. And Isaiah sees this whole thing, and you know what he says? It says he falls on his face, cries out, woe is me. I'm undone. It says, because I'm unclean. And I live among a people who are unclean. And my eyes have seen the Holy One. He says, I'm dead. That's why Isaiah says, I'm done for. In his presence, I do not belong. I'm done. That's terror. Until what happens? You guys remember? One of the burning ones takes a coal from the altar, comes down and touches it to his lips. That moment cleanses him and makes him holy. Now, I want to ask you, in that moment, did Isaiah lose his fear of God? Did God become less than high and exalted, less than a light, less than filling the temple, less than worthy of the worship of the burning ones? Did he become less? No. But Isaiah became clean, accepted into his presence, and soon to become a partner of God as God sent him out into the world on his mission. So God didn't change, and it would be absurd to think that Isaiah lost his awe and respect. But he lost his dread. He now belonged in the presence of God. He was clean. That's what's happened here. Plenty of people in the world, if they have any spiritual sensitivity at all, have an understanding that they should be afraid of God. Because God still is everything that we said he is. He still is awesome. He still is majestic in holiness. He still is, the Bible even uses the word terrible sometimes, not meaning like bad, but meaning like massive and awesome and terrifying and all of these things. He still is all of that. But we've changed through Jesus. We have been accepted into his presence. We are clean and welcomed. We are his partners and his kids. We are his completely and forever. So we need fear, no condemnation or separation or judgment. That kind of self-absorbed fear is off the table for us. That doesn't mean that God is tame. It doesn't mean that he's weak. Still a lion. But his bite doesn't kill us. It corrects us. Still a consuming fire. But we are not consumed in the process. Instead, our sin is consumed. We're made more like him. Still the Holy One. His holiness is not destructive to us. Instead, it's refining and changing of us. So because he's all these things, we stop dreading him, but we don't stop fearing him. We don't stop honoring him. In fact, we can now love him appropriately. As you think about it, the same is true if you think about any other kind of love, right? I've heard there are two different kinds of reactions that people have to the ocean. There are some people who have terror of the ocean. My daughter, again, Marta. Hi, Marta. My daughter, Marta, is one of those people, has terror of the ocean. There are other people who love the ocean. And if you really love it, you still fear it. Because it's big, powerful, and you can do nothing to control it. But the people who love it the most fear it the most. They respect it, honor it. The same is true of a person, right? So often, we live in a relationship with another person in a way that we call love, but it's completely self-centered. Because most of our actions toward the other person can be about avoiding disappointment or making ourselves more comfortable, doing the things that we know we have to do so that we can be more comfortable in the relationship. That's self-absorbed. When in fact, if we truly love somebody, the reason we do things is because we want them to thrive, want them to flourish out of a healthy respect and honor they are. It doesn't change that there's still fear involved. It's different. One is fear for myself. The other is fear for the other person, if that makes sense. Think about it back to God again. Am I living my relationship with him in fear for myself, fearing myself? I don't want wrath. I don't want punishment. I don't want condemnation. I don't want whatever else. He's telling us that in the Bible, throughout the Bible, 1 John and Romans, there is no condemnation. There's no punishment. There's nothing. You don't obey because of that anymore. That said, have then a fear for God. Honor him. Show him the respect that he's due. To make sure that his name is treated the way that it deserves to be treated. Make sure that the world sees him as he actually is. That's the motivation, because that is a different kind of a fear. It's still fear. It's just different. Does that make sense? So Moses says, fear God, which will result in obedience. Notice, as I said a second ago, obedience can be the fruit of either kind of fear. You can obey because you have a dread of God, but that'll only go so far. And in doing so, you're not loving him. You're just trying to protect yourself. In other words, you can isolate yourself from the object of your obedience in obedience. That makes sense? I think about the story of the prodigal son. Remember, there was a second son who stayed at home. He stayed at home, and when his brother comes home and receives the lavish grace and love of the father, he's angry. And what does he say? I've been here every day working hard for you, and you've never given me anything. He shows us that it's possible to be isolated from the father while still obeying, because he's obeying out of a very different set of motivations. That's possible, to be isolated from God in obeying God, because we're doing it out of this fear, this terror, this dread. But it's also possible to experience the lavish love of God and still hold respect and a fear that is focused toward him and not toward ourselves. That's what Moses is saying. Fear God, and let that fear of him, that reverence of him, that love of him overflow into obedience. That's what you do for the person you love. We want to please them. We want to honor them. We want to become like them. Finally, last one. I'll make this one short, I promise. Moses says, last thing. Deuteronomy 10, hold fast to God. Deuteronomy 10:20, he says, fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is the one you praise. He is your God who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your eyes. I love that word, hold fast. In Hebrew, it's one word. The word is davak. Stick together. Like glue. Glue yourself to him. When you go into the promised land, there will be lots and lots of other things that you could stick yourself to. There will be idols. There will be good things and bad things. I mean, we're going to see in the promised land that the blessings of the promised land themselves can become idols. We're also going to see that people will export idols in from outside, other nations and other gods. There'll be bad stuff that you can worship, and there'll be good stuff that you can worship. But at the end of the day, it says, hold fast to him. He's the one you praise. He is your God. He has the one who has led you. Stick to him like glue. That's what it literally says in Hebrew. Stick to him like glue. In other words, stubbornly persist in choosing God above everything else, even in the face of endless alternatives. Always be other alternatives to worship. Always be something else. Chances are, in any given day, not just one thing, but 5, 10 things that will demand your affection and your attention. Those moments, stick to him. Know that every other alternative, luring, promising, especially when we consider what we talked about at the beginning, right? Especially when it seems like he's distant. When it seems like you can't hear his voice, you can't see the pillar of fire anymore, you're not eating bread from his hand anymore. And then suddenly there's this alternative that's right in front of you. Sparkly and right there and loud and obvious, because idols are always loud and obvious. The Holy Spirit is subtle, patiential. Idol is loud and demanding. Right there, and it'll be so easy to grab. You know, Jesus talks about how there's 2 roads. The road that leads to destruction is wide and easy to walk. It's so easy. All you have to do is reach out and take it. But they will always promise more than they can deliver. Always break your heart. Love him. Remember who he is. Hear him in a healthy way. Stick to him. Not let anything get between. I'm going to wrap up with this quote from C.S. Lewis. It's out of a book of his called The Weight of Glory. I had it in my notes, but I don't anymore. So I'll just read it off the screen. It says, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. Far too easily. Lewis's version of stick to him. Basically saying so many of us think that the problem with our Christian lives, our struggle in Christian life, is that our desire for other things is, we just have these like too strong of desires for all this other stuff. And what Lewis is saying here is no. Your desire is too weak. You're just settling for things that are so much lesser. Settling for things that will never satisfy you. You're looking at it and saying, man, I wish I didn't want this thing as much. You know, this thing that promises joy or promises satisfaction or promises happiness. And God is looking at you and saying, I just wish you wanted happiness more. I wish you wanted satisfaction more, because if you did, you would never grab that thing, because it cannot deliver what you know I can. That makes sense? Stick to it. Hold fast, Moses said. These are a father's words. These are a grandfather's words, knowing that he's about to send his kids off to the promised land and he's not going to go with them. What do I need you to know? Forget. Remember who he is. Love him with everything you've got. Love him with your heart, soul, your strength. Let that love inspire in you a different kind of a fear. Not the fear of like an angry, vindictive God, but the fear that the healthy respect and honor due to you. Anything ever come between you and him? Right. God, thanks so much for my friends. Thank you for this community. Thank you for these words that echo down to us through the generations, through the ages. These words of wisdom from a father, may they be inspiring for our church as well. We have our own lives to lead and our own challenges to face as we walk out the doors of this place. Hear your voice, we want to know who you are, but sometimes it's hard for us, and the world doesn't help, and we're all trying to figure out how best to live this life with you. Moses' words inspire us. And most importantly, the foundation of this whole thing, behind every one of these pieces of advice, every one of these commands, we know that we are deeply loved, have already loved us with everything you've got. That becomes the foundation then